You've always been selfish, Emma. Your brother needs a reliable car for his new job. He deserves your car more than you do. My mother's words hung in the air of their kitchen, the Sunday family dinner suddenly silent as everyone froze. The homemade lasagna on my plate turned tasteless as I set my fork down, trying to process what I'd just heard. After 5 years of 12-hour night shifts as a nurse, making car payments with money I'd earned saving lives, my mother expected me to simply hand over my blue Honda Civic to my brother Tyler because he'd landed an entry-level position at a tech startup. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the day I bought Stella, my 2015 Honda Civic. It was 3 weeks after I passed my nursing certification, my first major purchase as a real adult with a real career. The dealership in Riverside was having an end-of-season sale, and I'd spent months researching the most reliable, fuel-efficient option that would get me safely to and from Greenfield Medical Center during those late-night shifts. This one has great safety ratings, the salesperson had told me. Perfect for someone who works unusual hours. I'd smiled, feeling a surge of pride as I signed the paperwork. My parents hadn't come with me, Dad was golfing, and Mom was helping Tyler prepare for a job interview. I'd called Olivia instead, my best friend since high school, who cheered when I drove off the lot. "Your first big girl purchase," she'd exclaimed, insisting we take a celebratory drive along the river with the windows down and music blasting. Over the next 5 years, that car became more than just transportation. Stella carried me through blizzards to reach patients during weather emergencies. Her trunk had held countless grocery runs to stock my first apartment. The back seat had transported rescue supplies during the Meadowbrook flood relief effort. I'd added a custom sound system that had cost 3 months of careful saving, installed by Joe Martinez at his local garage, who'd taught me basic maintenance along the way. "Take care of her, and she'll take care of you," Joe had advised, showing me how to check the oil and tire pressure. I had taken care of her. Every oil change, every tire rotation, every recommended maintenance schedule followed to the letter. While my brother Tyler went through 2 used cars in the same period, vehicles he'd neglected until they sputtered to a costly halt. Now my mother stared at me across the dining room table of my childhood home, waiting for a response. Tyler sat beside her, not quite meeting my eyes, but with an expectant expression nonetheless. My father studied his plate, unwilling to get involved as usual. "Mom, this car is mine. I worked for it. I pay for it. I maintain it," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice even. "But your brother's office is 20 miles away," she countered, as if distance alone justified her request. "And you live so close to the hospital. You could easily take the bus." The easily part made my jaw clench. My shifts often ended at 3 a.m. when no buses ran in our town. Walking home in the dark through Riverside's more questionable neighborhoods wasn't exactly a safe alternative. "Tyler's salary at Next Level will be twice what I make," I pointed out. "He can afford a car payment." My mother's expression hardened. "We've always taught you to help family. Your brother has student loans from his MBA. You've been established longer." Established. As if my nursing career, the nights spent holding the hands of dying patients, the countless hours on my feet, the emotional toll of the pandemic years, was just some casual job I'd fallen into, while Tyler's business degree represented real achievement. "I've worked hard for what I have," I said quietly. "That includes my car." Tyler finally spoke up. "Come on, Em. It's not like you have far to go. I've got this big commute now." The assumption in his voice, that of course I would give in, like I always had, sparked something in me. Growing up, I'd always been the responsible one, the peacekeeper. Tyler, 2 years younger, had been the family star, his achievements celebrated while mine were simply expected. When he needed soccer cleats, I wore hand-me-downs. When he wanted computer programming camp, I babysit the neighbor's kids to earn spending money. I looked around at their faces. My mother's righteous certainty, Tyler's entitled expectation, my father's deliberate absence from the conflict, and suddenly saw with perfect clarity a pattern that had defined our family for decades. "I need to go," I said, standing up and grabbing my purse. "Early shift tomorrow." My mother's voice followed me to the door. "Emma Wilson, we're not finished discussing this. Family supports family." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Yes, Mom. Family should support family. All members of the family." The drive back to my apartment was a blur, tears threatening but not falling as I gripped Stella's steering wheel. I called Olivia the moment I got home. "They what?" Her outrage on the other end of the line was exactly what I needed. "Please tell me you didn't agree to this?" "I didn't," I confirmed, sinking onto my couch. "But Mom's not going to let it go. She never does." "Then you need to make it crystal clear," Olivia said firmly. "You're an adult who pays her own way. This isn't a teenage squabble over borrowing clothes." She was right, of course. At 28, I was well past the age where my parents should have any say in my possessions. Yet their disapproval still held such power, triggering that childhood need to please them that I'd never quite outgrown. "What would you do?" I asked. "I'd shut this down permanently," Olivia replied without hesitation. "In a way they can't argue with." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, thinking about boundaries, how I'd never established them with my family, how overdue that process was. The next morning, I made a decision. My shift at Greenfield Medical Center was particularly grueling. A multi-car accident had emergency rooms packed, and I didn't leave until 2 hours after my scheduled time. Exhausted, I drove straight to Martinez Auto Repair instead of home. Joe looked up from the engine he was working on, wiping his hands on a rag. "Emma? Stella giving you trouble?" "Not Stella," I smiled tiredly. "Family trouble. I need some advice." Over the next half hour, as Joe checked my car over, "Just being thorough while you're here," I explained the situation. Unlike my family, Joe had always treated me with respect, teaching me about car maintenance instead of assuming I couldn't understand, praising my determination to keep Stella in perfect condition. "Families get funny ideas about who deserves what," he said thoughtfully, checking my tire pressure. "But that car's title is in your name. Legally, it's yours to decide." "That's exactly it," I responded, something clicking into place. "It's mine to decide." That evening, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I stopped at the bank and then the DMV, where I filled out several forms and paid a small fee. Finally, I drove to the Daily Grind and ordered a large coffee with an extra shot of espresso. I would need the energy for what came next. My mother called twice while I sat there, but I let it go to voicemail. I needed to be centered and clear when we spoke again. 3 days passed before the next family confrontation. I'd been working doubles and genuinely didn't have time for another dinner. But on Thursday evening, my doorbell rang, and I opened it to find both my parents standing there. "We need to talk," my mother said, walking past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. My father followed with an apologetic shrug. "Tyler needs an answer about the car," she continued, settling onto my couch as if this were a reasonable discussion. "He has orientation at Next Level on Monday, and he needs reliable transportation." I took a deep breath. "My answer is no, Mom. The car is mine. I need it, and I'm not giving it to Tyler." Her face reddened. "This selfishness isn't like you, Emma. Your brother." "My brother is a 26-year-old man with a business degree and a well-paying job," I interrupted. "He has options. He can buy a car, lease one, or take public transportation until he saves enough for a down payment, just like I did." "We've always taught you to share," my father finally spoke up, though his tone lacked conviction. "Sharing is mutual, Dad," I replied evenly. "When has Tyler ever been asked to sacrifice for me?" The question hung in the air. We all knew the answer. "This discussion is over," my mother declared, standing up. "We'll expect you at Sunday dinner, where you can tell your brother yourself why you're refusing to help him." Friday and Saturday passed in a blur of hospital shifts and preparations. I slept poorly, rehearsing what I would say, how I would finally establish the boundaries I should have set years ago. By Sunday afternoon, as I drove to my parents' house, a strange calm had settled over me. They were all on the back patio when I arrived, Mom arranging a platter of grilled chicken, Dad manning the barbecue, and Tyler scrolling through his phone. Brandon, Tyler's friend from college, was there too, which surprised me. I hadn't expected an audience. "Emma's here," my father announced unnecessarily as I stepped into the backyard. My mother immediately launched in. "Have you reconsidered your position?" "Brandon's father works at the bank, and he says they could transfer the loan to Tyler's name easily." So, that explained Brandon's presence. He was part of the pressure campaign. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They'd been planning this ambush, discussing my car loan with outsiders without my knowledge or consent. "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse, "I have something for Tyler." Everyone looked up, my mother's face brightening with premature triumph. I handed Tyler an envelope. "This is for you, for your new job." Looking confused but pleased, he opened it and pulled out a bus pass and a printed schedule. "What's this?" "The express bus runs from Meadowbrook to the Tech Corridor every 30 minutes, I explained. "I checked, and there's a stop 2 blocks from Next Level. That monthly pass gets you unlimited rides." The silence was deafening. Brandon suddenly became very interested in his phone. "You can't be serious," my mother finally sputtered. "A bus pass? When you have a perfectly good car." "I am serious," I replied calmly. "And I have something else." I pulled out a second envelope and placed it on the patio table. "This is a copy of Stella's title transfer. I've removed the bank as lien holder because I paid off the remaining balance in full on Tuesday. The car is completely mine now, free and clear." My father picked up the document, studying it with genuine surprise. "You paid it off? That's impressive, Emma." My mother wasn't so easily deterred. "That doesn't change anything. You can still sign it over to your brother." "I won't be doing that," I said firmly. "But what I can do is help Tyler research reliable used cars in his price range. I can connect him with Joe at Martinez Auto, who won't overcharge him. I can even drive him to dealerships until he finds something. That's the help I'm offering." Tyler stared at the bus pass, then at me. Something shifted in his expression, perhaps the first recognition that the automatic deference he'd always received might be changing. "Mom, it's okay," he said finally. "Emma's right. I can get my own car." My mother looked between us, seemingly unable to process this united front of adult independence. "This isn't how family treats each other," she insisted, but her tone had lost some conviction. "Actually, Mom," I said gently, "this is exactly how family should treat each other, with respect for boundaries and recognition of each person's needs and efforts. I love you all, but my car is non-negotiable." I stayed for dinner, and while the conversation was stilted at first, a new dynamic had been established. My father asked genuine questions about my work at the hospital for the first time in years. Tyler admitted he hadn't researched car options because he'd assumed mine would be available. Even my mother, though clearly unhappy with the outcome, refrained from further demands. As I was leaving, Tyler walked me to my car. "I didn't realize how much Stella meant to you," he said awkwardly. "I just thought, since you've always helped me out." "That's on me," I admitted. "I never set proper boundaries, but we're adults now, Ty. We need to support ourselves." He nodded slowly. Brandon's sister is selling her Toyota. Maybe I'll look at that. Let me know if you want company when you check it out, I offered. Driving home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. The car that had represented my independence had become the catalyst for establishing it in my family relationships as well. The next morning, I received a text from my father. Proud of you for standing your ground. Taking your mother to the dealership later to look at options for Tyler. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. 2 weeks later, Tyler drove his newly purchased used Subaru to my apartment, asking for advice on regular maintenance. As we sat on my steps with the owner's manual between us, I realized that sometimes the most caring thing you can do for family isn't giving them what they demand. It's helping them develop the same self-reliance you've worked so hard to achieve yourself. The key, I told him, is consistent care from the beginning. That prevents bigger problems down the road. I was talking about the car, but we both knew it applied to much more than that. Tyler finally spoke up. Come on, Em. It's not like you have far to go. I've got this big commute now. The assumption in his voice, that of course I would give in, like I always had, sparked something in me. Growing up, I'd always been the responsible one, the peacekeeper. Tyler, 2 years younger, had been the family star. His achievements, celebrated while mine were simply expected. When he needed soccer cleats, I wore hand-me-downs. When he wanted computer programming camp, I babysit the neighbors' kids to earn spending money. I looked around at their faces, my mother's righteous certainty, Tyler's entitled expectation, my father's deliberate absence from the conflict, and suddenly saw with perfect clarity a pattern that had defined our family for decades. I need to go, I said, standing up and grabbing my purse. Early shift tomorrow. My mother's voice followed me to the door. Emma Wilson, we're not finished discussing this. Family supports family. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. Yes, Mom. Family should support family. All members of the family. The drive back to my apartment was a blur, tears threatening but not falling as I gripped Stella's steering wheel. I called Olivia the moment I got home. They what? Her outrage on the other end of the line was exactly what I needed. Please tell me you didn't agree to this. I didn't, I confirmed, sinking onto my couch. But Mom's not going to let it go. She never does. Then you need to make it crystal clear, Olivia said firmly. You're an adult who pays her own way. This isn't a teenage squabble over borrowing clothes. She was right, of course. At 28, I was well past the age where my parents should have any say in my possessions. Yet their disapproval still held such power, triggering that childhood need to please them that I'd never quite outgrown. What would you do? I asked. I'd shut this down permanently, Olivia replied without hesitation. In a way they can't argue with. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, thinking about boundaries, how I'd never established them with my family, how overdue that process was. The next morning, I made a decision. My shift at Greenfield Medical Center was particularly grueling. A multi-car accident had emergency rooms packed, and I didn't leave until 2 hours after my scheduled time. Exhausted, I drove straight to Martinez Auto Repair instead of home. Joe looked up from the engine he was working on, wiping his hands on a rag. Emma? Stella giving you trouble? Not Stella. I smiled tiredly. Family trouble. I need some advice. Over the next half hour, as Joe checked my car over, just being thorough while you're here, I explained the situation. Unlike my family, Joe had always treated me with respect, teaching me about car maintenance instead of assuming I couldn't understand, praising my determination to keep Stella in perfect condition. Families get funny ideas about who deserves what, he said thoughtfully, checking my tire pressure. But that car's title is in your name. Legally, it's yours to decide. That's exactly it, I responded, something clicking into place. It's mine to decide. That evening, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I stopped at the bank and then the DMV, where I filled out several forms and paid a small fee. Finally, I drove to the Daily Grind and ordered a large coffee with an extra shot of espresso. I would need the energy for what came next. My mother called twice while I sat there, but I let it go to voicemail. I needed to be centered and clear when we spoke again. 3 days passed before the next family confrontation. I'd been working doubles and genuinely didn't have time for another dinner. But on Thursday evening, my doorbell rang, and I opened it to find both my parents standing there. "We need to talk," my mother said, walking past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. My father followed with an apologetic shrug. "Tyler needs an answer about the car," she continued, settling onto my couch as if this were a reasonable discussion. "He has orientation at Next Level on Monday, and he needs reliable transportation." I took a deep breath. "My answer is no, Mom. The car is mine, I need it, and I'm not giving it to Tyler." Her face reddened. "This selfishness isn't like you, Emma. Your brother—" "My brother is a 26-year-old man with a business degree and a well-paying job," I interrupted. "He has options. He can buy a car, lease one, or take public transportation until he saves enough for a down payment, just like I did." "We've always taught you to share," my father finally spoke up, though his tone lacked conviction. "Sharing is mutual, Dad," I replied evenly. "When has Tyler ever been asked to sacrifice for me?" The question hung in the air. We all knew the I answer. "This discussion is over," my mother declared, standing up. "We'll expect you at Sunday dinner, where you can tell your brother yourself why you're refusing to help him." Friday and Saturday passed in a blur of hospital shifts and preparations. I slept poorly, rehearsing what I would say, how I would finally establish the boundaries I should have set years ago. By Sunday afternoon, as I drove to my parents' house, a strange calm had settled over me. They were all on the back patio when I arrived, Mom arranging a platter of grilled chicken, Dad manning the barbecue, and Tyler scrolling through his phone. Brandon, Tyler's friend from college, was there too, which surprised me. I hadn't expected an audience. "Emma's here," my father announced unnecessarily as I stepped into the backyard. My mother immediately launched in. "Have you reconsidered your position? Brandon's father works at the bank, and he says they could transfer the loan to Tyler's name easily." So that explained Brandon's presence. He was part of the pressure campaign. They'd been planning this ambush, discussing my car loan with outsiders without my knowledge or consent. "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse, "I have something. For Tyler." Everyone looked up, my mother's face brightening with premature triumph. I handed Tyler an envelope. "This is for you, for your new job." Looking confused but pleased, he opened it and pulled out a bus pass and a printed schedule. "What's this?" "The express bus runs from Meadowbrook to the Tech Corridor every 30 minutes, I explained. "I checked, and there's a stop 2 blocks. From Next Level. That monthly pass gets you unlimited rides." The silence was deafening. Brandon suddenly became very interested in his phone. "You can't be serious," my mother finally sputtered. "A bus pass? When you have a perfectly good car?" "I am serious," I replied calmly, "and I have something else." I pulled out a second envelope and placed it on the patio table. "This is a copy of Stella's title transfer. I've removed the bank as lien holder because I paid off the remaining balance in full on Tuesday. The car is completely mine now, free and clear." My father picked up the document, studying it with genuine surprise. "You paid it off? That's impressive, Emma." My mother wasn't so easily deterred. "That doesn't change anything. You can still sign it over to your brother." "I won't be doing that," I said firmly. "But what I can do is help Tyler research reliable used cars in his price range. I can connect him with Joe at Martinez Auto, who won't overcharge him. I can even drive Him to dealerships until he finds something. That's the help I'm offering. Tyler stared at the bus pass, then at me. Something shifted in his expression. Perhaps the first recognition that the automatic deference he'd always received might be changing. "Mom, it's okay," he said finally. "Emma's right. I can get my own car." My mother looked between us, seemingly unable to process this united front of adult independence. "This isn't how family treats each other," she insisted, but her tone had lost some conviction. "Actually, Mom," I said gently, "this is exactly how families should treat each other, with respect for boundaries and recognition of each person's needs and efforts. I love you all, but my car is non-negotiable." I stayed for dinner, and while the conversation was stilted at first, a new dynamic had been established. My father asked genuine questions about my work at the hospital for the first time in years. Tyler admitted he hadn't researched car options because he'd assumed mine would be available. Even my mother, though clearly unhappy with the outcome, refrained from further demands. As I was leaving, Tyler walked me to my car. "I didn't realize how much Stella meant to you," he said awkwardly. "I just thought, since you've always helped me out." "That's on me," I admitted. "I never set proper boundaries, but we're adults now, Ty. We need to support ourselves." He nodded slowly. "Brandon's sister is selling her Toyota. Maybe I'll look at that. Let me know if you want company when you check it out," I offered. Driving home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. The car that had represented my independence had become the catalyst for establishing it in my family relationships as well. The next morning, I received a text from my father. "Proud of you for standing your ground. Taking your mother to the dealership later to look at options for Tyler." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. 2 weeks later, Tyler drove his newly purchased used Subaru to my apartment, asking for advice on regular maintenance. As we sat on my steps with the owner's manual between us, I realized that sometimes the most caring thing you can do for family isn't giving them what they demand. It's helping them develop the same self-reliance. "You've worked so hard to achieve yourself. The key," I told him, "is consistent care from the beginning. That prevents bigger problems down the road." I was talking about the car, but we both knew it applied to much more than that. The situation with my family seemed resolved, at least on the surface. Tyler had his Subaru, Dad had expressed his subtle approval, and even Mom had stopped bringing up my selfishness during our weekly phone calls. But beneath this new calm, I sensed unresolved tensions. The car incident had exposed fault lines in our family dynamic that couldn't be repaired with a single boundary-setting conversation. This became painfully clear at Thanksgiving, 3 months after the car confrontation. I'd volunteered to work the holiday shift at Greenfield, partly because holiday pay was substantial, but mostly because I knew many of my colleagues had young children eager for turkey and tradition. I'd arranged to stop by my parents' house in the evening for leftovers and family time. When I arrived, still in my scrubs after a 12-hour shift, the dining room table had been cleared except for a single place setting. My mother stood at the kitchen sink, aggressively scrubbing a roasting pan. "There's a plate for you in the microwave," she said without turning around. Everyone else finished hours ago. The emptiness of the house surprised me. "Where is everyone?" "Your father took Tyler and his new girlfriend to the cinema, that new Marvel movie he's been wanting to see." The silent accusation hung in the air. I had chosen work over family, while Tyler had prioritized properly. Never mind that I'd told them weeks ago about my schedule, or that I'd covered holidays for years so colleagues with children could be home. Never mind that my work literally involved keeping people alive. I heated my plate of turkey and mashed potatoes and sat alone at the large dining table. Mom busied herself in the kitchen, the clattering of pots and pans filling the awkward silence. When I finished eating, I brought my plate to the sink. "Thank you for saving me dinner. It was delicious," She nodded stiffly, taking the plate without comment. "Mom," I said gently, "I told you weeks ago I'd be working today. I'm here now." "It's fine, Emma. We understand your priorities." The familiar guilt rose in my chest, that well-worn path of emotional manipulation that had always led me to apologize, to compensate, to overextend myself to earn back approval. But this time, I recognized it for what it was. My priority today was providing care for patients whose families couldn't be with them, I said. Just like my priority 3 months ago was protecting the car I worked hard to earn. Neither of those things means I don't value family. My mother finally turned to face me, dish towel twisted in her hands. "Ever since this car business, you've changed. You used to understand the importance of looking out for your brother." "I've always looked out for Tyler," I replied. Memories flooding back, helping him with homework while our parents attended his soccer games, lending him money for dates in high school, editing his college application essays. "But at some point, we both need to stand on our own." She shook her head as if I'd missed an obvious point. "Family is different. Family means sacrifice." "Yes, it does," I agreed. "But sacrifice should be reciprocal, not one-sided." The front door opened before she could respond, bringing in a wave of laughter and conversation. Tyler entered the kitchen first, his arm around a petite woman with curly brown hair. "Emma, you made it," he said with genuine warmth. "This is Zoe. Zoe, my sister Emma, the nurse I told you about." "The one who wouldn't give you her car," Zoe said playfully, extending her hand. "Tyler told me all about it. I told him he was crazy for even asking." The comment hung awkwardly in the air. My mother's back stiffened, but Tyler laughed. "Yeah, not my finest moment," he admitted. "Best thing that could have happened, though. I love my Subaru. It's got way better ground clearance for camping. Trips." The casual acknowledgement stunned me. In the month since our confrontation, Tyler had apparently processed and accepted the situation in ways my mother couldn't. He'd moved forward while she remained stuck in resentment. Dad entered the kitchen, giving me a one-armed hug. "Good shift?" "Busy but good," I replied, suddenly aware of my wrinkled scrubs and tired face compared to everyone's movie night casual attire. "How was the film?" "Predictable," my father shrugged. "Too many explosions." "It was awesome," Tyler corrected, grabbing a leftover roll from a basket on the counter. "Emma, you should come with us next time. Zoe's brother works at the theater. We get discount tickets." This small inclusion, being invited into his new life, his new relationship, felt significant. A recognition of my place in his world beyond the familial obligations our mother had always enforced. We moved to the living room, where Zoe asked thoughtful questions about nursing that allowed me to share aspects of my career my family had rarely shown interest in. Tyler mentioned he'd been considering volunteering at a weekend coding camp for high school students. "It's amazing how teaching something helps you understand it better," he said. "Joe at the auto shop showed me how to change my oil last week. Said, you'd taught him a few things about healthcare when he fixed your sound system." "Joe's a good guy," I smiled, surprised that Tyler had sought out my mechanic friend. "He says Stella's a keeper," Tyler added. "Says you maintain her better than most of his customers who drive luxury cars." My mother, who had remained largely silent since we moved to the living room, finally spoke. "Well, Emma's always been responsible. I suppose that's why we thought she could help you with transportation." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of my side I'd ever heard from her. The evening ended on that cautiously positive note. As I prepared to leave, Tyler and Zoe insisted on walking me out to my car. The temperature had dropped, and frost sparkled on Stella's blue hood under the streetlight. "I meant to ask," Tyler said as I unlocked the door, "what made you decide to pay off the car all at once? Wasn't that a big chunk of your savings?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to consider the financial implications. "It was," I admitted. "But it was worth it for the security of knowing it's completely mine." Zoe nodded approvingly. Smart move. My sister's still underwater on her car loan after 4 years. Plus, Tyler added with unexpected insight, I guess it made a pretty clear statement to Mom and Dad. I smiled slightly. That was a secondary benefit. After they returned inside, I sat in Stella's familiar interior, letting the engine warm up. Through the front window, I could see my family in the living room. Tyler animated as he told some story, Zoe laughing, my parents listening. A normal family scene. But something fundamental had shifted, both within me and in my family's perception of me. The car confrontation had been a catalyst, forcing everyone to see me not as the reliable daughter who would always accommodate, but as an adult with legitimate needs and boundaries. The following week brought an unexpected development. My team at Greenfield was implementing a new patient care protocol, requiring additional training sessions scheduled during my usual days off. I was leaving one such session, mentally reviewing the new procedures, when I spotted my mother sitting in the hospital cafeteria. For a moment, I wondered if she was ill. She rarely came to Riverside unless absolutely necessary. But she appeared perfectly healthy, nervously stirring a cup of tea. Mom? I approached her table. Is everything okay? She looked up, startled. Emma. I was going to wait until your shift ended. The reception desk told me you'd be done at 4. Training session, I explained, sliding into the chair opposite her. What's going on? She pushed her tea aside and folded her hands on the table. I wanted to talk to you somewhere neutral. Not at our house, not at your apartment. The formality of this statement concerned me. About what? Your father and I have been discussing things, she began, her voice unusually tentative. After Thanksgiving, he pointed out some patterns in how we've treated you and Tyler over the years. I held my breath, hardly daring to hope for what this conversation might become. It wasn't intentional, she continued, a defensive edge creeping in. Tyler just always seemed to need more attention, more resources, more help. You were so self-sufficient from such a young age. Being self-sufficient doesn't mean I didn't need support, I said quietly. It just meant I learned not to ask for it. Her eyes widened slightly, as if this perspective had never occurred to her. Your father said something similar, that we'd taken advantage of your responsibility. She pulled a small velvet box from her purse and placed it on the table between us. This isn't to make up for anything, it's just a recognition. I opened the box to find a delicate silver chain with a small pendant, a vintage nursing pin that had belonged to my grandmother, who had been a nurse during World War II. I should have given you this when you graduated, my mother said, regret evident in her voice. I kept thinking there would be a better time, a special occasion. But then your car situation made me realize I've been waiting for perfect moments, instead of recognizing the accomplishments right in front of me. The pin glittered under the cafeteria's fluorescent lights, a tangible acknowledgement of the professional path I'd chosen and the family legacy I was continuing. It wasn't an explicit apology, but from my mother, this gesture represented a significant shift. It's beautiful, I said, touching the pin gently. Thank you. Your grandmother would have been proud, she added. She was stubborn too, knew her own mind. Coming from my mother, this comparison was high praise indeed. We talked for another hour, not solving decades of family dynamics in a single conversation, but beginning a new pattern of communication. She asked specific questions about my work that showed genuine interest rather than perfunctory politeness. I shared stories about patients, maintaining confidentiality, of course, that helped her understand the weight and joy of my profession. As we prepared to leave, she hesitated, then said, I was wrong about the car, Emma. Your brother did not deserve it more than you. The simple statement, offered without qualifications or excuses, felt monumental. The spring after the car incident brought unexpected changes to our family. Tyler and Zoe got engaged in April, a whirlwind romance that surprised everyone except my father, who claimed he'd seen it coming since that first movie night. The engagement shifted family dynamics yet again, with wedding planning becoming the new focal point of my mother's energy. I found myself grateful for the diversion. Her detailed discussions of flower arrangements and venue options meant fewer opportunities to analyze my life choices. I volunteered to host the engagement party at my apartment, partly as a peace offering and partly to demonstrate my support for Tyler's happiness. The evening before the celebration, as I was arranging furniture to accommodate 20 guests in my modest living space, my doorbell rang. "Perfect timing," I called out, assuming it was the early delivery of the catering I'd ordered. "You can put everything on the kitchen counter." Instead, I opened the door to find my mother, arms filled with table linens and a small potted orchid. "I thought you might need some help setting up," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Typical mom behavior, though the offer of assistance was new. "Thanks," I said, taking the orchid. "That wasn't necessary, but I appreciate it." She surveyed my living room with a critical eye, but instead of the expected criticism about my decorating choices, she nodded approvingly. "You've made this place lovely, Emma. Those blue curtains really brighten the room." The compliment, so freely given, momentarily rendered me speechless. My mother had never been generous with praise, particularly regarding anything related to my independence from the family home. We worked side by side, transforming my apartment into a celebration space. She arranged her crisp white table linens while I hung string lights across the ceiling. The silence between us was companionable rather than tense, a new development in our relationship. "Tyler seems happy," I ventured as we finished. "Zoe's good for him." "She challenges him," my mother agreed, smoothing a wrinkle from the tablecloth. "Makes him think about someone besides himself for a change." The casual acknowledgement of my brother's self-centeredness, a trait she had previously defended or ignored, stunned me. My mother must have noticed my expression because she smiled, ruefully. "I'm not completely blind to his faults, Emma. She hesitated, searching for words. "I worried about him more. Maybe because he seemed less capable than you in some ways. And now? Now I think I underestimated him and overprotected him." She adjusted a flower arrangement with meticulous attention. The car situation, as frustrated as I was about it, forced him to solve his own problem. And he did, quite competently. This admission felt monumental, though delivered in my mother's typical matter-of-fact tone. We had never directly discussed the car confrontation since that day in the hospital cafeteria when she'd given me Grandma's nursing pin. "Tyler told me he's taking financial management classes," I said. "Something about wanting to understand investment options for his and Zoe's future." My mother nodded. "Your father's idea. Tyler actually asked for his advice last month. First time that's happened since he was in high school." We finished our preparations in this new, more honest conversational territory. As she was leaving, my mother paused at the door. "I've been thinking about what you said, about sacrifice being reciprocal. I'm trying to do better at seeing the whole picture." She touched my arm briefly. "The engagement party is lovely. You're a good sister, Emma." The next evening, as family and friends celebrated Tyler and Zoe's engagement in my transformed apartment, I found myself observing the subtle shifts in our family ecosystem. Tyler had stepped into a new maturity, consulting Zoe before making decisions, taking responsibility for aspects of the party planning. My father, always quiet in family gatherings, actively engaged with Zoe's parents about their shared interest in gardening. And my mother, instead of micromanaging every detail as she typically would, allowed the celebration to unfold organically. Joe from the auto shop came as Tyler's guest, an unexpected friendship that had developed through their shared interest in cars. He brought a vintage hood ornament mounted on a wooden base as an engagement gift, which delighted the couple. Your brother's not half bad once he stops expecting the world to revolve around him, Joe commented as we stood by the refreshment table. Said you taught him about checking fluids and tire pressure. I laughed. I might have mentioned a few things when he got his Subaru. Mostly I just channeled your wisdom. Well, it stuck. He's been bringing that car in for regular maintenance like clockwork. Joe raised his glass slightly. Nice job with the boundaries, by the way. Word at. The shop is you paid off your car to make a point. Word at the shop? Small town, he shrugged. People talk, especially when it involves standing up to Karen Wilson. Your mom's got quite the reputation for getting her way. The idea that my personal stand had become minor local gossip was mortifying. But Joe's approving tone suggested it was viewed positively in the community. As summer approached, my work at Greenfield intensified with a hospital-wide implementation of new electronic health records. The transition meant longer hours and additional responsibilities, as I'd been selected to train other nurses on the system. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the schedule was grueling. One evening, after a particularly challenging shift dealing with both technical glitches and a critically ill patient, I arrived home to find a small package propped against my apartment door. Inside was a travel mug with a note. For those early hospital shifts, drive safely. Dad. The simple gesture brought unexpected tears. My father had always been the quiet presence in our family drama, rarely taking sides, but also rarely offering direct support. This acknowledgement of my work schedule and concern for my safety represented his own version of boundary recalibration. I used the mug the next morning, the sturdy ceramic keeping my coffee hot during the pre-dawn drive to Greenfield. As I navigated the familiar route in Stella, the headlights illuminating the empty streets, I reflected on how a confrontation about a car had catalyzed significant changes in how my family understood and respected each other's independence. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few cars from the overnight shift clustered near the emergency entrance. I pulled into my usual spot, gathering my belongings before heading inside. As I locked Stella, a voice called my name. Nurse Wilson. I turned to see Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly patient I had cared for during her recovery from pneumonia earlier that year. She was walking slowly toward the hospital entrance, leaning heavily on a cane. Mrs. Abernathy, I greeted her warmly. How are you feeling? Better than last time you saw me, she smiled. Just here for a follow-up with Dr. Mehta. Is that your car? The blue Honda? Yes, that's Stella, I confirmed, wondering at the question. Mrs. Abernathy nodded approvingly. I remember you mentioning her during my stay. Said she got you safely to work even in that terrible snowstorm when half the staff couldn't make it in. I was touched that she had remembered such a small detail from our conversations. During Mrs. Abernathy's week-long stay, I had spent many night shifts in her room, monitoring her oxygen levels and keeping her company when anxiety made sleep elusive. She's very reliable, I agreed. Good, the elderly woman said firmly. You need dependable transportation in your line of work. Lives depend on it. The simple validation from this former patient, recognizing the essential nature of my car, not as a luxury, but as a critical tool for my profession, felt profoundly affirming. Mrs. Abernathy had understood inherently what my family had initially failed to see, that my car represented more than personal convenience. It was an extension of my commitment to patient care. I helped her to the hospital entrance, where an aide was waiting with a wheelchair. As I continued to the staff locker room, her words stayed with me. Lives depend on it. A simple truth that put the entire car conflict into sharp perspective. My shift that day was particularly hectic. 2 emergency surgeries, a code blue in SAR, the cardiac unit, and ongoing technical issues with the new record system. By mid-afternoon, I was running on determination and coffee, having skipped lunch to help stabilize a post-operative patient whose vital signs had suddenly deteriorated. When I finally took a brief break in the staff room, I found a text message from Tyler. Need car advice. Subaru making weird noise. Okay to stop by Martinez Auto this afternoon? Could use backup. I smiled at the request, my brother asking for my expertise rather than assuming my assistance. The subtle shift in language reflected our evolving relationship. After my shift ended, I drove directly to Martinez Auto, finding Tyler's Subaru already in one of the service bays. He and Joe were bent over the open hood, discussing something in technical terms I couldn't quite catch from the doorway. Emma. Joe spotted me first. Perfect timing. Was just explaining to your brother why regular oil changes matter. Tyler looked up, a smudge of grease on his forehead. Slight exaggeration. I've been religious about maintenance. This is something else, a clicking sound when I accelerate. Joe wiped his hands on a shop towel. CV joint needs replacing. Not because of negligence, he added quickly. Just normal wear and tear. I've got the part in stock, can fix it tomorrow. What's the damage? Tyler asked, reaching for his wallet. Parts and labor. About $340, Joe replied. Could be worse. Tyler nodded without complaint, another sign of his maturing approach to car ownership. The Tyler of a year ago would have lamented the unfairness of repair costs, perhaps even hinted that financial help would be welcome. Thanks for coming, he said as we walked out to the parking lot. Wanted a second opinion I could trust. Happy to help, I replied, genuinely pleased by his request. That's what family does. He looked at me sideways, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Yeah, but not by giving away their cars. The joke, Tyler making light of his former entitlement, signaled how far we'd come. We could reference the conflict without tension, acknowledge the lesson without resentment. Want to grab dinner? He suggested. Zoe's at her sister's bridal shower, and I'm temporarily carless. We ended up at Riverside Diner, a local institution, with vinyl booths and the best milkshakes in town. Over burgers and fries, our conversation wandered through wedding plans, my hospital stories, and Tyler's new role at Next Level. They're sending me to the Seattle office next month, he mentioned. Between bites, training the team there on our new software platform. That's impressive, I said, genuinely proud of his professional growth. Big responsibility. He shrugged, but I could see he was pleased by the recognition. It's a good opportunity, but it got me thinking about something else. What's that? Remember how we used to talk about road tripping to the Olympic Peninsula? Back in high school, we had that whole route planned. Mount Rainier, Seattle, the rainforest, those beaches with the massive driftwood. I did remember. It had been a shared dream, maps spread across the living room floor as we plotted an adventure neither of us could afford at the time. The plan had gradually faded as we moved into adulthood and separate lives. I was thinking, Tyler continued, maybe we could actually do it. After the wedding, but before Zoe and I start looking at houses. A sibling road trip, like we always talked about. The invitation touched me deeply. Not just the revival of our old dream, but the implication that despite the conflict and growth of the past year, Tyler still valued our connection beyond obligatory family ties. I'd like that, I said simply. I'd need to request time off well in advance, but it's definitely doable. 2 cars, though, he grinned. I'm not subjecting my Subaru to your playlist for 2,000 miles. I laughed, throwing a French fry at him. Your loss. My playlist is exceptional. We lingered over dessert, refining the rough outline of this future adventure. As we finally left the diner, the evening had settled into full darkness, stars visible despite the town's lights. Tyler paused before getting into my car. You know what's weird? If Mom had gotten her way about your car, I don't think we'd be planning this trip right now. What do you mean? I'd still be the entitled younger brother. You'd still be the responsible big sister picking up my slack. He leaned against Stella's roof, expression thoughtful in the parking lot's dim lighting. The car thing, as awkward as it was, forced us to reset, see each other differently. His insight surprised me. I had recognized how the confrontation had changed my relationship with our parents, but hadn't fully appreciated its impact on Tyler's perception of our sibling dynamic. Plus, he added with a grin, now we'll have appropriate vehicles for the terrain. My Subaru for the mountain passes, your Civic for the city driving. Practical and environmentally conscious, I agreed, matching his lighter tone. We drove back to Martinez Auto so Tyler could leave a check for the next day's repairs. Then I took him home to the small house he and Zoe were renting near the tech corridor. As he got out of my car, he tapped Stella's roof lightly. Thanks for not giving in, he said quietly. I didn't understand it then, but I get it now. Driving home alone, I realized that the car confrontation had initiated a cascade of healthy recalibrations throughout our family system. My mother had begun recognizing her pattern of uneven expectations. My father had found small ways to demonstrate support. Tyler had developed new independence and respect for boundaries. And I had learned that standing firm didn't necessarily mean standing alone. The following weekend, our family gathered for dinner at a local restaurant to celebrate my mother's birthday. The occasion was notably relaxed compared to previous family gatherings, conversation flowing easily, gentle teasing replacing tense undercurrents. When dessert arrived, a chocolate cake with entirely too many candles, my mother made a small speech thanking everyone for coming. Then she added something unexpected. I've been reflecting on what makes a family strong, she said, looking around the table. It's not just supporting each other, though that matters. It's respecting each other's journeys, even when they look different from what we imagined. Her gaze rested briefly on me, a silent acknowledgement of our evolving understanding. Later, as we were leaving the restaurant, she linked her arm through mine, a rare physical demonstration of affection. Tyler mentioned you two are planning that Pacific Northwest trip you used to talk about, she said. If our schedules align, I confirmed. It's still in the early planning stages. She nodded thoughtfully. When you go, I have something that might be useful. Your grandmother's travel journal from when she drove cross-country in 1952 might give you some ideas. The offer of this family heirloom, my adventurous grandmother's documentation of her own independent travels, felt symbolic. My mother was not just accepting my autonomy, but celebrating the family legacy of self-determination it represented. I'd love to see that, I told her. As we reached the parking lot, our family naturally divided toward our respective vehicles. My parents to their sensible sedan, Tyler and Zoe to their Subaru, and me to Stella, waiting faithfully under the streetlight. Drive safely, my mother called out. A standard parental caution, but delivered now with respect rather than anxiety. I settled into Stella's driver's seat, adjusting the mirror before pulling out of the parking space. In the reflection, I could see my family getting into their own cars, each of us heading toward separate homes, but still connected by the invisible bonds of our shared history and evolving future. The car that had become a symbol of conflict had transformed into something else entirely, a catalyst for growth, a tangible reminder that sometimes standing firm in your boundaries can ultimately strengthen rather than damage the relationships that matter most. As I drove through the quiet streets of Riverside toward my apartment, I reflected on how far we had come since that Sunday dinner, when my mother had declared that Tyler deserved my car more than I did. The journey hadn't been easy or straightforward, but it had led us all to a healthier place, one where belonging to a family didn't require surrendering your independent identity. Stella's engine hummed steadily beneath me, reliable as always. I patted the dashboard affectionately, grateful not just for the transportation she provided, but for the unexpected lessons her ownership had taught us all. The Pacific Northwest, Trip with Tyler materialized more quickly than expected. Next Level accelerated their training schedule, requiring Tyler to visit Seattle just 2 months after his initial mention of our childhood dream. When he called to tell me about the change of plans, I could hear the disappointment in his voice. "They need me there in 3 weeks," he explained. "The Olympic Peninsula loop will have to wait until next year, I guess." I checked my calendar while still on the phone with him. By some miracle, I had 4 consecutive days off scheduled during the exact time he'd be in Seattle. A rare alignment in my typically fragmented nursing schedule. "What if I fly out to meet you?" I suggested impulsively. "You'll be done with training by Friday, right? We could do a condensed version of the trip over a long weekend. Not the full 2-week adventure we planned as kids, but better than nothing." The excitement in Tyler's voice confirmed I'd made the right offer. "You'd do that? It won't be cheap on short notice." "I have some savings," I replied, mentally calculating costs. "And Stella's maintenance fund has a surplus since I've been doing most of the routine work myself." Just 3 weeks later, I found myself landing at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport on a Thursday evening, the Olympic Mountains visible in the distance as my plane descended through scattered clouds. Tyler was waiting at the baggage claim, looking surprisingly professional in dress pants and a button-down shirt. His work attire for the training sessions he'd been conducting all week. "Corporate life suits you," I teased as he enveloped me in a hug. "Don't get used to it," he laughed, grabbing my rolling suitcase. "I've got hiking boots and flannel in the car, ready for tomorrow's escape." Tyler's company had provided him with a rental car for the week, a silver Outback that he'd already loaded with camping gear and supplies. As we drove from the airport to his downtown hotel, he pointed out landmarks and shared stories from his week of business meetings. "The team here is actually implementing some of my code modifications," he explained, a hint of pride in his voice. "First time the parent company has adopted a satellite office's innovations." "That's impressive," I said, genuinely happy for his professional recognition. "They're lucky to have you." He glanced at me quickly before returning his eyes to the road. "Thanks. That means a lot coming from you." The simple exchange reflected our new dynamic, mutual appreciation replacing the competitive undercurrent that had characterized much of our childhood. Tyler had stopped measuring his accomplishments against mine, and I had learned to accept. His success without feeling it somehow diminished my different path. We spent that evening finalizing our abbreviated adventure plans, spreading maps across his hotel room floor, much as we had done as teenagers in our parents' living room. The original 2-week itinerary had to be drastically condensed, but the essential experiences remained: Hurricane Ridge, Lake Crescent, Ruby Beach, and the Hoh Rainforest. 4 major ecosystems in 3 days, Tyler mused, tracing the route with his finger. Ambitious, but doable. "We'll have to sacrifice some of the longer hikes," I acknowledged, "but we'll hit the highlights." The next morning, we set out. Before dawn, the city still quiet as we headed toward the ferry that would take us across Puget Sound. As we pulled onto the massive boat, the rising sun illuminated the water, turning it to rippled gold. We abandoned the car in the hold and climbed to the passenger deck, watching Seattle's skyline recede as we crossed toward the Olympic Peninsula. "We really made it," Tyler said, the wind ruffling his hair. "Our childhood road trip actually happening." "A modified version," I smiled, "but yes, we made it." The day unfolded like a perfect travel montage, winding mountain roads leading to Hurricane Ridge's panoramic views, picnic lunch beside the turquoise waters of Lake Crescent, late afternoon, exploration of Solduke Falls where rainbow mist drifted through ancient forest. By sunset, we had reached the Pacific coast, setting up our tent on a designated campsite near Ruby Beach. As darkness fell, we sat beside a small campfire, the rhythmic crash of ocean waves providing background music to our conversation. The stars emerged in dazzling profusion, far more visible here than in Riverside's light-polluted skies. "Remember when we used to camp in the backyard?" Tyler asked, poking the fire with a stick. I laughed. Mom would check on us every hour until she finally gave up and made us come inside around midnight. She was convinced we'd either freeze to death or be kidnapped from our own backyard, he agreed. Always the worst-case scenario with her. She's gotten better about that, I observed. More willing to let people make their own choices, even if she thinks they're wrong. Tyler nodded thoughtfully. The car standoff was a turning point. After you refused to give in, she had to recalibrate her whole approach. Not just with me, I pointed out. She's less controlling with you too. True, he acknowledged. She hasn't once questioned my and Zoe's wedding plans, which is frankly miraculous. We fell silent, watching sparks rise from the fire toward the star-filled sky. The distance from our daily lives provided perspective on how much had changed in our family over the past year. You know what I realized recently? Tyler said finally. If you had given me your car like Mom wanted, I wouldn't have learned how to manage my own finances. I wouldn't have researched car loans and insurance rates. I wouldn't have built my credit score by making regular payments. I'd still be avoiding responsibility because someone else always handled the hard stuff. The insight surprised me. Not the observation itself, but the fact that Tyler had reflected so deeply on the situation. I used to resent how easily everything came to you, he continued, staring into the fire. Good grades, steady job, responsible. Financial decisions. I didn't see all the work behind it. The studying, the extra shifts, the budgeting. I just saw the results and felt inferior by comparison. Nothing came easily, I said quietly. I just learned early that no one was going to do it for me. Tyler looked up, understanding dawning in his expression. Because they were too busy doing it for me. The simple truth hung between us in the cool night air. Our parents' differential treatment had affected us both, granting Tyler privileges while simultaneously denying him the growth that comes from earned achievement, forcing me towards self-reliance while making me feel my efforts were simply expected rather than noteworthy. We both got shortchanged in different ways, I acknowledged. But we're figuring it out now. Better late than never, he agreed, raising his thermos of hot chocolate in a small toast. The weekend continued in this vein, natural wonders punctuated by moments of deeper connection and understanding. We hiked through the Hoh rainforest's moss-draped majesty, marveling at trees older than our country. We combed Ruby Beach at low tide, discovering vibrant starfish and anemones in tidal pools. We drove mountain roads with the windows down, singing along to the mixed playlist we'd compromised on. Throughout it all, we talked, really talked, about our childhoods, our current lives, our hopes for the future. Free from the established patterns of family gatherings and parental expectations, we discovered the adults we had become and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. On our final evening, camped at a different site closer to Seattle for my early morning flight, Tyler brought up a topic I hadn't expected. I'm thinking of starting a college fund for Zoe's nephew, he said as we prepared a simple dinner on our camp stove. He's only 2, but education costs keep rising. That's thoughtful, I replied, surprised by this forward-thinking financial planning from my formerly impulsive brother. Any particular reason? Tyler was quiet for a moment, focusing intently on stirring the pasta sauce. His parents are stretched thin. 3 kids, single income, medical bills from the youngest one's asthma. It reminds me of stories Mom's told. About her childhood. Always worrying about money. Always feeling one emergency away from disaster. I hadn't expected this level of empathy or awareness from Tyler, who had generally been shielded from financial realities growing up. College made such a difference for me, he continued. I want Liam to have that opportunity regardless of his family's situation. Zoe agrees. We're going to start small but contribute regularly. That's really admirable, I said sincerely. Financial security is such a gift, especially when it comes with no strings attached. Tyler looked up, a knowing expression crossing his face. Like the strings Mom tried to attach to your car? I nodded, appreciating his perception. Exactly. Like that. Help should empower, not control. I've been thinking about that a lot, he admitted. About the difference between genuine support and manipulation disguised as generosity. This philosophical turn from my brother, once focused primarily on immediate gratification and self-interest, demonstrated a maturity I wouldn't have recognized in him a year earlier. The car conflict had catalyzed growth not just in our relationship with our parents, but in Tyler's fundamental understanding of responsibility and autonomy. As we packed up our campsite the next morning, preparing for the drive back to Seattle and my departing flight, Tyler handed me a small package wrapped in newspaper. Souvenir, he explained with an uncharacteristic shyness. Spotted it in that little shop near Lake Crescent. Inside was a keychain carved from local driftwood, a miniature blue car dangling from the ring. For Stella, he grinned, honorary participant in our Pacific Northwest adventure. The thoughtful gift, acknowledging both my car's importance and the resolved conflict surrounding it, touched me deeply. It represented not just a souvenir of our trip, but a tangible symbol of our transformed relationship. It's perfect, I told him, immediately attaching it to my keys. Thank you. The drive back to Seattle passed too quickly, both of us reluctant to end this rare pocket of uninterrupted sibling time. At the airport drop-off zone, Tyler helped me with my suitcase, then surprised me with a tight hug. This was the best weekend, he said. We should make it an annual tradition, different destination every year. I'd like that, I agreed. Next time with more planning and less red-eye flights. He laughed. Deal. Safe travels, Em. As I navigated security and found my gate, I reflected on how far we had come from that tense Sunday dinner. The car that had become a flashpoint for family conflict had ultimately led to something unexpected. A healthier, more balanced relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligatory family ties. When my plane landed in Riverside late that night, I was exhausted but content. The taxi dropped me at my apartment building, and I trudged up the stairs, looking forward to my own bed after nights in a tent. As I unlocked my door, my phone chimed with a text from Tyler. Made it home okay? This simple check-in, Tyler making sure I had arrived safely, represented the new equilibrium in our relationship. Not him expecting me to manage everything, not me feeling responsible for his well-being, but two adults expressing appropriate care for each other. Safe and sound, I replied, already missing those mountain views. Same, working on next year's destination ideas. Sleep well. I smiled as I set my phone down, unpacking just the essentials before collapsing into bed. The new driftwood keychain dangled from my key ring on the nightstand, a reminder of mountains and rainforests, of starry skies and ocean waves, of conversations beside campfires, and most importantly, of bridges rebuilt on more solid foundations. 2 days later, life returned to its normal rhythms. I was back at Greenfield for the night shift, moving between patients' rooms with practiced efficiency. Around 3 a.m., during the quietest hours when most patients were asleep, I took a quick break in the staff room, scrolling through the trip photos Tyler had shared to our family group chat. Nancy, one of the senior nurses, peered over my shoulder. Beautiful scenery. Vacation? Long weekend with my brother, I explained. Abbreviated version of a road trip we've been planning since high school. That's your brother? The one who wanted your car? Nancy asked, surprising me. I looked up at her, confused. How did you know about that? She laughed softly. Small hospital, smaller town. Joe from Martinez Auto is my cousin's husband. The car story made the rounds. Woman stands up to family. Pressure. Refuses to give away car she worked hard for. You're something of a local legend among certain circles. The idea that my private family drama had become public knowledge was mortifying, yet Nancy's tone suggested admiration rather than gossip. "It wasn't quite that dramatic," I demurred. "Maybe not," Nancy shrugged, "but it resonated with people. Standing your ground about something that matters isn't as common as it should be." After she left to check on her patients, I sat thinking about her comment. The car conflict had never been just about transportation. It had been about recognition, about boundaries, about redefining family relationships on more equitable terms. Perhaps that's why it had struck a chord with others who had faced similar struggles. My phone lit up with a text from my mother. "Your car in the shop? Saw you getting dropped off at apartment yesterday. Everything okay?" The question was casual, but represented a significant shift. A year ago, she would have immediately assumed car trouble was an opportunity to revisit the "Tyler needs your car" argument. Now, it was simply a practical inquiry. "All good," I replied. "Just tired from the flight. Took a taxi rather than drive tired." "Smart decision," came her response, followed by a second message that made me smile. "Dad and I looking at Alaska? Cruise brochures. Thinking of booking for our anniversary next year. Thoughts?" My parents rarely traveled beyond visiting relatives in neighboring states. This potential adventure, inspired perhaps by Tyler's and my trip photos, suggested they too were expanding their boundaries and exploring new possibilities. As I returned to my nursing rounds, checking vital signs and administering scheduled medications, I reflected on the unexpected ripple effects of standing firm in that pivotal moment. My refusal to relinquish my car had catalyzed growth not just in my immediate family relationships, but potentially in my parents' willingness to venture beyond their comfort zones. The weeks following my return from Seattle brought a flurry of wedding preparations as Tyler and Zoe's ceremony approached. I found myself unexpectedly included in many of the planning discussions, my opinions sought and valued. My mother, historically prone to dominating such events, demonstrated remarkable restraint, repeatedly deferring to the couple's preferences even when they diverged from her traditional expectations. "It's their day," she said simply when I commented on her newfound flexibility regarding the unconventional food truck reception the couple had chosen. "My job is to support, not direct." This philosophical shift, ongoing and imperfect but nonetheless real, continued to manifest in small, significant ways. When I mentioned considering a professional development course that would require adjusting my schedule at Greenfield, my mother offered to research options rather than questioning. The necessity? When Tyler and Zoe announced they were considering job opportunities in Portland after the wedding, potentially moving 3 hours from Riverside, my parents responded with genuine interest in their reasons rather than immediate resistance. The car that had represented independence to me and entitlement to Tyler had become the unlikely catalyst for our family's evolution. By refusing to participate in the established pattern of unequal expectations, I had created space for everyone to reconsider their roles and responsibilities. 2 days before Tyler's wedding, I drove to my parents' house to help with last-minute preparations. As I pulled into their driveway, I noticed my father in the garage, methodically organizing tools on his workbench, his typical stress management activity before major events. "Need some help?" I offered, joining him in the garage's familiar space. He looked up with a smile. "Just keeping busy while your mother finalizes seating arrangements for the 15th time." I laughed, picking up a wrench and returning it to its designated spot. "Some things never change." "And some things do," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "Your mother mentioned you might be considering a management position at Greenfield." "Clinical coordination supervisor," I confirmed, surprised my mother had shared this preliminary career exploration with him. Still in the early discussion stages, would mean more administrative work, fewer night shifts, potential for further advancement. My father nodded, carefully arranging screwdrivers by size. Sounds like a good opportunity. Your grandmother, my mother, always said you had leadership qualities, even when you were little. The mention of my paternal grandmother, who had passed away when I was in high school, touched me deeply. She had been a quiet, observant woman who showed her affection through practical support rather than effusive praise. I didn't know she said that, I admitted. She noticed things, my father replied. How other children would naturally follow. Your lead, how you'd organize neighborhood games, how you'd step up when something needed doing. She predicted you'd find your way to a position of responsibility eventually. This glimpse into how I had been seen and valued by a family member I had deeply respected but lost too soon provided unexpected validation. While my achievements had often seemed unremarkable within our family dynamic, overshadowed by the attention given to Tyler's more flamboyant accomplishments, they had not gone entirely unnoticed. "Thank you for telling me that," I said softly. My father squeezed my shoulder briefly, one of his rare physical demonstrations of affection. "She'd be proud of who you've become, not just professionally, but personally. Standing up for yourself last year with the car situation, that took courage." Coming from my conflict-avoidant father, this explicit approval of my boundary setting meant more than any professional recognition. He had witnessed the uneven treatment patterns in our family for years, but had rarely intervened directly. This acknowledgement suggested he had seen more clearly than I'd realized. It wasn't easy, I admitted. I always thought being a good daughter, a good sister, meant putting everyone else's needs first. "A common misconception," he replied, returning to his tool organization. "Real family strength comes from mutual respect, not one-sided sacrifice." As we continued working side by side in comfortable silence, I realized that the car confrontation had freed not just me, but also my father, giving him permission to express his own observations and values more directly, to step out of his habitual role as peacekeeper and into a more authentic engagement with family dynamics. The unassuming blue Honda parked in their driveway, the vehicle that had triggered such unexpected family recalibration, had become more than transportation. It had become a tangible reminder that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to draw clear, firm boundaries around what matters to you. Tyler's wedding day arrived with perfect late summer weather. Sunshine warming the morning air, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves, not a cloud threatening the outdoor ceremony. I woke early in my childhood bedroom, where I'd stayed overnight to help with final preparations. The house was already buzzing with activity. My mother's voice drifted up the stairs as she directed the florist where to place arrangements. I showered quickly and dressed in comfortable clothes for the morning preparations, leaving my bridesmaid's dress carefully hung on the back of the door. As I made my way downstairs, I found my father in the kitchen, methodically making coffee for what would clearly be a long day. "Morning," he greeted me, sliding a mug across the counter. "Your mother's been up since 5. Why am I not surprised?" I smiled, gratefully accepting the coffee. "Where's Tyler?" "Still asleep, presumably. Zoe's father took him and the groomsmen out last night. Bachelor celebration." I raised an eyebrow. "Should we be worried?" My father shook his head, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Mark promised to have him home by midnight, reasonably sober. Said something about all of them having too much respect for Zoe to let things get out of hand." This subtle shift, Tyler surrounded by friends who valued responsibility and consideration, was yet another positive change in his life. The young men he'd hung around with in college had been notorious for excessive partying and questionable decision-making. The morning unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. I accompanied my mother to the botanical garden venue, helping set up personal touches the couple had selected. Framed photos of their relationship milestones, handwritten notes. For each guest, small potted succulents as eco-friendly favors. Zoe arrived with her bridesmaids, her usual calm demeanor tinged with excited anticipation. "How's Tyler?" she asked as we arranged the bridal suite. Still alive according to Dad, I replied, making her laugh. They're meeting us here at 11. As we worked, Zoe shared anecdotes about the apartment she and Tyler had found in Portland, a bright corner unit in an older building, walking distance to the farmer's market, with a small balcony perfect for container gardening. They would move shortly after returning from their honeymoon, beginning their married life in a new city with promising job opportunities for both of them. We've been researching car charging stations, she mentioned as she carefully unpacked her delicate veil. Thinking of going electric for our next vehicle. That's forward-thinking, I commented, helping her smooth the gossamer fabric. Tyler's idea, actually. Said something about wanting to make more environmentally conscious choices as we plan our future. She smiled affectionately. He's been full of surprising perspectives lately. I nodded, recognizing this evolved version of my brother, thoughtful about long-term consequences, considering impacts beyond his immediate desires. The transformation that had begun with car ownership had expanded into a more holistic maturity. By 11, my fellow bridesmaids and I were helping Zoe into her dress, a simple, elegant design that complemented her practical nature while still capturing the magic of the occasion. As I fastened the tiny pearl buttons running down her back, she caught my eye in the mirror. "I want to thank you," she said quietly. "For the buttons? They're tricky, but I've almost got them," I replied, focusing on the delicate task. "No," she shook her head slightly. "For standing your ground with Tyler last year, about your car." My hands paused on the buttons, surprised by her bringing up this topic on her wedding day. "That's ancient history," I demurred, "and hardly relevant today." "But it is," she insisted. "When I first met Tyler, he was still expecting things to come easily, assuming others would accommodate his preferences. That version of Tyler wasn't ready for an equal partnership." The insight struck me as remarkably perceptive. Zoe had identified something I hadn't fully articulated, how the car confrontation had prepared Tyler not just for adult responsibilities, but for a healthier romantic relationship. "The man I'm marrying today understands that relationships require mutual respect and compromise," she continued. "He values what he earns and respects what others have worked for. That shift started with you refusing to give him your car." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door, the photographer arriving to capture pre-ceremony moments. The conversation shifted to lighting and poses, the intimate moment of acknowledgement, complete but deeply appreciated. The ceremony itself was everything a wedding should be: personal, meaningful, occasionally humorous, and ultimately moving. Tyler's voice caught slightly as he recited vows he had written himself, promising not just love and fidelity, but also equal partnership and mutual growth. Standing beside Zoe in my sage green bridesmaid's dress, I felt a surge of pride in the man my brother had become. During the reception, as guests mingled in the Botanical Gardens Central Pavilion, I found a quiet moment with Tyler near the koi pond that formed the venue's centerpiece. "Congratulations," I said, clinking my champagne glass against his. "Beautiful ceremony." "Thanks," he smiled, looking more content than I'd ever seen him. Everything worked out perfectly. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the orange and white fish glide beneath lily pads. "Zoe said something interesting earlier," I ventured finally, "about how our car situation last year changed things for you." Tyler nodded, thoughtfully. "She's right. It was a wake-up call in ways I didn't fully appreciate at the time." "How so?" "When you refused to give me your car, it was the first time someone in our family had directly challenged the assumption that my needs came first." He swirled the champagne in his glass, watching the bubbles rise. "It forced me to question why I'd expected it in the first place." The self-awareness in his response impressed me. The Tyler of a year ago would have defended his expectations rather than examining them. "That questioning led to others," he continued. "About responsibility. about earning versus being given, about considering the impacts of my choices on other people. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. It made me a better person, a better partner for Zoe. I'm glad something positive came from it, I said sincerely, though that wasn't my motivation at the time. I know, he chuckled. You were just trying to keep your car. But the ripple effects went way beyond transportation. Our conversation was interrupted by the event coordinator announcing it was time for the couple's first dance. Tyler squeezed my shoulder as he moved to join his new wife on the dance floor. Watching them sway together to the music, their faces reflecting a deep, mature connection, I felt a sense of completion, as if a story that had begun with conflict had found its way to the most satisfying possible conclusion. Later that evening, as the reception wound down and guests began departing, my mother joined me at a corner table where I was resting my feet after hours in heels. "Beautiful wedding," I commented as she sat beside me. "Everything came together perfectly." "Tyler and Zoe did most of the planning themselves," she replied, surprising me with this acknowledgement of their agency. "They have good taste and clear vision." We watched as the newlyweds said goodbye to departing guests, their easy coordination and mutual attentiveness evident even in this simple activity. "They're well matched," my mother observed, "both independent but stronger together." The assessment, appreciating both autonomy and partnership, reflected my mother's evolving perspective on relationships. A year ago, she might have focused solely on how Zoe would support Tyler's ambitions, rather than recognizing their complementary strengths. "Speaking of independence," she continued, smoothing her dress with an uncharacteristically hesitant gesture, "your father and I have been discussing our retirement plans." "Oh?" I prompted, curious about this unexpected topic shift. "We're considering downsizing, selling the house once Tyler and Zoe are settled in Portland, looking at those new condominiums near Riverside Park." This was surprising news. My parents had lived in the same house for over 30 years, accumulating decades of memories and possessions. A move would represent a significant life change. "What prompted this?" I asked carefully. "Practical considerations, primarily," she explained. "The house is larger than we need, and the maintenance becomes more challenging each year. But also," she paused, seeming to choose her words deliberately, "watching you and Tyler establish your independent lives has been thought-provoking. Perhaps it's time for us to reimagine our own." The concept that my mother might have been inspired by her children's life choices, rather than simply directing them, represented a fundamental shift in family dynamics. The woman who had once insisted that Tyler deserved my car was now contemplating her own significant transition, influenced by observing our journeys toward autonomy. "I think that sounds wonderful," I said sincerely. "The condominiums have that beautiful community garden, don't they?" She nodded, visibly relieved by my positive response. "And a central location that would allow us to walk to more activities. As we get older, maintaining our independence will require different arrangements." The irony wasn't lost on me. My mother, who had once dismissed my need for independent transportation, was now actively planning for her own continued autonomy in advancing years. Without directly acknowledging it, she had absorbed the central lesson of our car conflict, that self-determination matters at every life stage. The wedding celebration continued around us, Tyler and Zoe now cutting their cake amid cheers and laughter. My father approached, offering his hand to my mother. "One more dance before the band packs up?" he suggested with a smile I rarely saw, playful, almost youthful. My mother accepted his hand, rising with unexpected grace. "Duty calls," she told me with a wink. "We'll continue our conversation about the condominiums tomorrow." As they moved toward the dance floor, I noticed something I hadn't seen in years. The easy synchronicity of their movement together, a physical manifestation of their decades-long partnership. beneath the often rigid exterior my mother presented. To the world, there existed this other dimension. A woman who had built a life with her chosen partner, raised children, and now faced the next transition with the same determined practicality. The following morning, as family members gathered at my parents' house for a post-wedding brunch before Tyler and Zoe departed for their honeymoon, the conversation naturally turned to their upcoming move to Portland. My mother, surprisingly, had prepared a detailed folder of practical information, local services, neighborhood amenities, even contact information for a highly recommended mechanic near their new apartment. "For the Subaru," she explained as Tyler leafed through the materials with evident appreciation. "Regular maintenance is essential with all-wheel drive." The casual reference to his car, acknowledging his ownership and responsibility without any hint of the previous controversy, demonstrated how completely our family had integrated the new relationship dynamics that had emerged from the conflict. After brunch, as the newlyweds prepared to leave, Tyler pulled me aside in the hallway. "Almost forgot," he said, handing me a small gift bag. "A thank you for everything this weekend." Inside the bag was a sleek, leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note. "For planning our next sibling adventure. Olympic Peninsula was just the beginning. T." The gift represented more than just appreciation for bridesmaid duties. It acknowledged our reconnected relationship and committed to its continuation despite geographic distance. The brother who had once expected to be given my car was now investing in maintaining our bond as equals. "It's perfect," I told him, genuinely touched. Already thinking about destination options. "Zoe suggested the Southwest," he grinned. "Grand Canyon, Sedona, maybe Santa Fe. Different landscape entirely." "With proper planning this time," I reminded him, "and equal driving shifts." "Deal," he agreed, pulling me into a quick hug before joining Zoe at the door for final goodbyes. As they drove away toward their new shared life, my father came to stand beside me on the porch. "Good outcome," he said simply, his typical economy of words conveying multiple layers of meaning. About the wedding, about Tyler's maturity, about our reconstructed family relationships. "Very good," I agreed, the leather journal still in my hands, a tangible symbol of progress. Later that afternoon, as I prepared to return to my apartment and the normal rhythms of work and life, my mother approached me in the driveway where Stella was parked. She ran her hand lightly over the car's roof, an unexpectedly affectionate gesture toward the vehicle that had catalyzed so much change. "She's served you well," my mother commented. "How many miles now?" "Just over 80,000, I replied, surprised by her interest. "Should be good for at least another 100,000 with proper maintenance." My mother nodded thoughtfully. "You chose wisely. Quality and reliability. The simple validation, acknowledgement that my independent decision had been sound, meant more coming from her than it might have from anyone else." Without explicitly referencing our past conflict, she was affirming both my judgment and my right to exercise it. "When you have time," she added, reaching into her pocket, "I'd appreciate your thoughts on these." She handed me a small stack of real estate listings, the condominiums she had mentioned during the wedding reception, each one carefully annotated with her precise handwriting, noting specific features and considerations. "You want my opinion?" I asked, genuinely surprised by this reversal of our usual roles. "You have good judgment," she said matter-of-factly, "and you'll notice practical details your father and I might overlook at this stage." The request represented a profound shift, my mother not merely accepting my autonomy, but actively seeking my perspective, recognizing that my independence had fostered valuable skills and insights. The woman who had once dismissed my need for a car was now soliciting my advice on her own significant life transition. "I'd be happy to look these over," I told her, carefully placing the listings in my bag. "Maybe we could tour a few together." Next weekend? She nodded, seemingly pleased by the suggestion. That would be helpful. I'd value your observations. As I drove home that evening, Stella's familiar engine humming reassuringly beneath me, I reflected on the extraordinary evolution our family had undergone in just 1 year. The conflict that had begun with my mother's declaration that Tyler deserved my car more than I did had ultimately led to a healthier, more balanced family system. One where individual autonomy was respected, where responsibility was recognized and valued, where support was offered without controlling strings attached. The blue Honda that had represented my hard-won independence had become the unlikely catalyst for growth that extended far beyond my own boundaries. Tyler had developed genuine maturity and self-reliance. My mother had begun reconsidering her approaches to control and support. My father had found more direct ways to acknowledge and validate. And I had learned that standing firm and protecting what mattered to me didn't necessarily damage family bonds. It could ultimately strengthen them by establishing more authentic connections. At a red light, I glanced at my keychain dangling from the ignition, the driftwood car charm from the Olympic Peninsula trip, a tangible reminder of reconnection. The house key I still carried, symbolizing enduring family ties despite necessary separation and individuation. These seemingly contradictory elements now existed in comfortable harmony, much like the new balance we had established in our family relationships. The light turned green, and I continued toward home, toward my independent life built through consistent effort and clear boundaries. In my rearview mirror, my parents' house receded, not abandoned or rejected, but appropriately distanced as we all moved forward on our respective journeys. Stella accelerated smoothly, carrying me toward whatever would come next. Continued career development, perhaps eventually a home of my own. Certainly more adventures with Tyler despite geographic separation. The car that had once been a contentious focal point had transformed into reliable transportation, not just physically, but emotionally, helping me navigate the complex territory of adult family relationships with greater clarity and purpose. As I pulled into my apartment complex, my phone chimed with a text from my mother. "Thank you for your help this weekend. Let me know when you're available to look at condominiums." The simple message, acknowledging my contribution and respecting my schedule, represented our new equilibrium. Not perfect, still evolving, but fundamentally transformed from where we had begun. I parked Stella in her usual spot, patting the dashboard affectionately before gathering my belongings. The vehicle that had sparked such controversy had ultimately facilitated growth that none of us could have anticipated when my mother uttered those triggering words at Sunday dinner. "Your brother deserves your car more than you do." As it turned out, what we all truly deserved was the opportunity to establish healthy boundaries, to take responsibility for our own choices, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligatory accommodation. The car had simply been the catalyst for discovering these deeper truths about family, autonomy, and genuine connection. Looking back at Stella as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I smiled at the thought of how a simple refusal had initiated such profound transformation. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys begin not with grand declarations, but with quiet, firm protection of what matters most. A lesson worth far more than any vehicle, no matter how reliable. 2 months after Tyler's wedding, autumn had transformed Riverside's landscape into a tapestry of gold and crimson. The hospital had been unusually busy, a viral respiratory infection sweeping through the community and filling Greenfield's beds with wheezing patients of all ages. I had worked 3 consecutive 12-hour shifts, finally reaching my scheduled days off with intense gratitude for uninterrupted sleep. On my first free morning, I awoke to an unexpected text from my father. "Your mother and I need your opinion on something important. Available this afternoon?" The message was characteristically brief but unusual in its urgency. My parents rarely requested immediate meetings, generally planning family interactions well in advance. Concerned, I called rather than texted back. "Dad, is everything okay?" I asked when he answered. "Everything's fine," he assured me quickly. "We're making decisions about the condominium purchase and could use your perspective. No emergency, just a timeline consideration." Relief washed over me. "I can come over around 2 if that works." "Perfect. We'll have lunch ready." The casual mention of prepared food signaled this was indeed important. My father rarely cooked unless the occasion warranted special effort. I showered and dressed, curious about what condominium decision could possibly require my in-person opinion rather than simply sharing photos or documents electronically. When I arrived at my parents' house, the home they were now preparing to leave after 3 decades, I found my mother in the kitchen arranging an elaborate charcuterie board while my father removed a homemade quiche from the oven. The level of culinary effort confirmed this was no ordinary consultation. "This looks wonderful," I commented, accepting a glass of iced tea from my father. "What's the occasion?" "Can't we simply enjoy having lunch with our daughter?" my mother replied, though her too casual tone suggested there was indeed more to the gathering. We settled at the dining room table, the same space where the car confrontation had erupted a year earlier. Now the atmosphere was entirely different. Relaxed, collaborative, with a subtle undercurrent of anticipation rather than tension. Over lunch, my parents shared updates on the condominium search. They had narrowed their options to 2 nearly identical units in the same complex. One with a slightly larger kitchen, the other with a better view of the community gardens. The decision seemed hardly momentous enough to warrant an in-person consultation. "Both sound lovely," I said, puzzled by the buildup. "I'm not sure what input I can offer beyond what you've already considered." My parents exchanged a glance, a silent communication born of decades together. My father nodded slightly, and my mother set down her fork with deliberate precision. "The condominium is only part of what we wanted to discuss," she began, her voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. "We've been reconsidering our overall arrangements as we downsize." My father picked up the thread. "The condominium purchase will free up significant equity from this house. We've been discussing the most appropriate allocation of those resources." The conversation had taken an unexpected turn into financial territory, an area my parents had traditionally kept private. Their generation viewed money discussions as somewhat taboo, even with adult children. "That makes sense," I said carefully, not wanting to intrude on their planning. "I'm sure your financial advisor has good recommendations." "He does," my father confirmed, "but we have some ideas of our own that we'd like your perspective on." My mother reached for a folder that had been placed on the nearby sideboard, her typical organization for important matters. From it, she withdrew several printed documents. "We're considering establishing a significant gift for both you and Tyler," she explained, sliding one paper toward me. "Equal amounts, of course, but potentially different structures based on your individual situations." I glanced at the document, a draft plan for a substantial financial gift that would effectively serve as an early inheritance. The amount listed made me blink in surprise. "This is very generous," I said, struggling to find appropriate words. "But completely unnecessary. You should use those resources for your own retirement security." "We've run the numbers carefully," my father assured me. "This allocation still leaves us with more than adequate provision for our needs, even calculating for extended longevity and potential care requirements." My mother leaned forward slightly. "For Tyler and Zoe, we're considering structuring this as assistance with a home purchase in Portland. They're currently renting, and property values there continue to rise." I nodded, seeing the practical value of such support for a young couple establishing themselves in an expensive market. "That makes perfect sense. It would give them security and build equity." "For you," she continued, "the situation is different. You already manage your finances exceptionally well. You have a stable career, reasonable housing costs, and no significant debt besides student loans. The assessment was accurate, but left me wondering where this was heading. My mother slid another document across the table. "We thought perhaps this might be meaningful," my father said, his voice gentler than usual. I looked down at the paper and felt my breath catch. It was information about a specialized nurse practitioner program, an educational advancement I had mentioned in passing months ago, but had set aside as financially impractical given my current responsibilities and resources. "The program at Westridge University," I said, surprised they had remembered this detail from a casual conversation. "But this is an investment in your future," my mother finished. "Similar to helping Tyler with housing, but tailored to your specific path and priorities." The thoughtfulness of the proposal, recognizing my professional aspirations rather than assuming traditional priorities, moved me deeply. This wasn't random generosity, but a carefully considered acknowledgement of my distinct goals and values. "We've spoken with your chief nursing officer," my father added, confirming the extent of their research. "Greenfield would support a flexible schedule during your studies, with potential advancement opportunities upon completion." The realization that my parents had gone so far as to consult my workplace, gathering practical information rather than simply presenting a well-meaning but impractical suggestion, demonstrated how profoundly our relationship had evolved. They were offering support that aligned with my established path rather than attempting to redirect it according to their preferences. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, genuine emotion making my voice unsteady. "This is incredibly thoughtful." "You don't need to decide immediately," my mother assured me, her typical directive tone absent. "Consider whether this would truly benefit your goals. If not, we can explore other possibilities." This freedom to accept or decline without pressure, to evaluate the offer based on my own assessment rather than their expectations, represented perhaps the most significant change in our family dynamic. The mother who had once demanded I give my car to my brother was now offering substantial resources with genuinely no strings attached. "Thank you," I said finally, looking at both of them. "For the generosity, yes, but more importantly for understanding. What would be meaningful to me specifically?" My father smiled slightly, reaching over to cover my mother's hand with his own. "We've been learning," he said simply. "Sometimes more slowly than we should have, but learning nonetheless." As we continued talking through the practical details of their proposal, I marveled at the transformation that had occurred in our family system. The car confrontation, painful and awkward as it had been, had ultimately opened a path to more authentic, respectful relationships. By refusing to participate in the established pattern of unequal expectations, I had inadvertently created space for everyone to reconsider long-standing assumptions and behaviors. Later, as I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the driveway where Stella was parked in her familiar spot. For a moment, we both looked at the blue Honda that had become such a pivotal element in our family narrative. "I was wrong," my mother said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "When I said Tyler deserved your car more than you did, I was completely wrong." The direct acknowledgement, without qualification or explanation, hung in the afternoon air between us. After all this time, I hadn't expected such an explicit reference to the conflict that had catalyzed so much change. "I know," I replied, simply. But in a strange way, I'm almost grateful for that moment now. It led to important shifts for all of us. She nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Sometimes our worst parenting moments create opportunities for growth we never anticipated. The self-awareness in this statement, my mother's recognition of her own fallibility and its unexpected benefits, demonstrated how far she had come in her own journey. The woman who had once been certain of her right to direct her adult children's decisions now acknowledged the limitations and unintended consequences of that approach. As I drove home that afternoon, Stella's familiar presence felt symbolic in new ways. The car that had represented my hard-won independence had become the unlikely catalyst for my entire family's growth. Tyler had developed genuine maturity and self-reliance. My parents had reconsidered deeply ingrained patterns of control and preference, and I had learned that standing firm in protecting what mattered to me didn't damage family bonds. It ultimately strengthened them by establishing more authentic connections. At a stoplight, I glanced at the specialized nurse practitioner program brochure my mother had insisted I take with me. The educational advancement it represented had been a distant dream, professionally desirable but practically challenging given financial and scheduling constraints. Now, with my parents' thoughtful support, it had become a viable possibility. What struck me most was not the financial assistance itself, but the nature of how it was offered, respectful of my autonomy, aligned with my established values, and completely free of controlling conditions. The gift represented not just resources but recognition, acknowledgement of my right to define my own path and priorities. The light turned green, and I continued toward home, toward the independent life I had built through consistent effort and clear boundaries. In my rearview mirror, my parents' house receded, not abandoned or rejected, but appropriately positioned as I moved forward on my own journey, now with unexpected but welcome support. Stella accelerated smoothly, carrying me toward expanded possibilities, advanced education, career development, continued independence with enhanced opportunities. The car that had once been a contentious focal point had transformed into reliable transportation, not just physically, but metaphorically, helping me navigate from conflict to resolution, from rigid patterns to flexible growth, from obligatory accommodation to authentic connection. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I found myself smiling at the thought of how a simple refusal had initiated such profound transformation. Sometimes, the most significant journeys begin not with grand declarations, but with quiet, firm protection of what matters most. A lesson worth far more than any vehicle, no matter how reliable. 3 years had passed since that pivotal Sunday, dinner when my mother declared Tyler deserved my car more than I did. Stella remained faithfully parked outside my new townhouse, now showing her age with minor scratches and a slightly faded paint job, but still running beautifully thanks to meticulous maintenance. My life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined when I'd made that simple, firm stand to protect what was mine. The specialized nurse practitioner program my parents had supported was now behind me, completed with honors despite the grueling schedule of working while studying. My new position as clinical care coordinator at Greenfield had brought both increased responsibility and more regular hours. No more 3 a.m. drives home through Riverside's questionable neighborhoods. The promotion had also provided the financial stability to purchase my modest townhouse, a 2-bedroom with a small garden that had become my sanctuary. Tyler and Zoe had established their life in Portland, their communications filled with tales of urban adventures and professional achievements. They'd purchased a charming craftsman bungalow with the help my parents had offered, gradually renovating it with sustainable materials and energy-efficient systems. Tyler's software development career had flourished, and Zoe had recently been promoted to director at her environmental nonprofit. Most significantly, they were expecting their first child, a daughter due in just 2 months. My parents had settled comfortably into their condominium near Riverside Park, embracing the lifestyle change with unexpected enthusiasm. My mother had discovered a passion for container gardening on their balcony, while my father had joined a community woodworking cooperative in the same complex. The smaller space had encouraged them to simplify their possessions, a process that had revealed forgotten treasures and prompted meaningful conversations about family history and legacy. It was a crisp October morning when I received the call from Tyler that would bring our family's journey full circle. "Emma, are you sitting down?" His voice carried an unusual blend of excitement and concern. "Should I be?" I asked, immediately alert. Is it Zoe? The baby? They're both fine, he assured me quickly. Actually, better than fine. Zoe's latest checkup showed everything progressing perfectly. But we've had an unexpected development. My company is transferring me to the Riverside satellite office. You're moving back? I couldn't hide my surprise. Tyler and Zoe had seemed completely settled in Portland, building a community and life they frequently described as ideal. Temporarily, he explained. The Riverside team needs leadership on a major project, 6 months minimum, possibly extending to a year. The timing is challenging with the baby coming, but they're offering significant incentives, including covering all our relocation costs. What does Zoe think? I asked, knowing her career was equally important to their partnership. That's the thing. Her organization has a Riverside chapter that's been trying to recruit her. They're viewing this as perfect timing, offering her a flexible arrangement through maternity leave and then a leadership position she can grow into at her own pace. The synchronicity seemed almost too perfect. So you're both coming back? When? That's why I'm calling. Tyler's voice took on the slightly hesitant tone I recognized from whenever he needed a favor. The transfer is happening quickly, just 3 weeks from now. Zoe shouldn't be flying this late in her pregnancy, so we're planning to drive. The company's arranged professional movers for our furniture and most belongings, but... But? I prompted when he paused. Zoe's doctor recommends she not sit in a car for the full 8-hour drive without significant breaks. We're looking at a 2-day journey with an overnight stay. Very gentle pace. I wondered if... I found myself smiling, already anticipating his request. If you might fly up to Portland and drive back with us, just for safety and peace of mind. Having a nurse along would make everyone feel better, especially since Zoe will be almost 36 weeks by then. The request was so different from the entitled demand of 3 years ago, thoughtfully framed, acknowledging my professional expertise rather than assuming my availability, clearly motivated by genuine concern rather than convenience. I'd be happy to, I replied without hesitation. I have some vacation time available. Just let me check with scheduling to make sure we're covered at Greenfield. Really? That would be amazing, Em. Thank you. The relief in his voice was palpable. Of course. That's what family does. Shows up when it matters. I know, Tyler said softly. I've learned that from you. 3 weeks later, I found myself stepping off a plane in Portland, the cityscape vastly different from Riverside's familiar outlines. Tyler met me at the baggage claim, immediately engulfing me in a hug that conveyed both genuine welcome and underlying anxiety about the impending move. Zoe's at her final prenatal appointment, he explained as we headed to the parking garage. Then we're all set for departure tomorrow morning. Tyler's Subaru had been replaced by a sensible electric SUV, more appropriate for a growing family. But I noticed he still kept it meticulously clean, the maintenance records tucked neatly in the glove compartment. How does it feel to be leaving? Portland? I asked as we navigated the city streets toward their soon-to-be former home. Bittersweet, he admitted. We've built something good here. But family proximity feels suddenly more important with the baby coming. And both our career opportunities in Riverside are genuinely exciting, not just convenient. The mature assessment struck me, Tyler weighing multiple factors thoughtfully, rather than making impulsive decisions based on immediate desires. When we arrived at their bungalow, most rooms were already packed into labeled boxes, the walls bare except for a few favorite art pieces carefully wrapped for transport in their car. Zoe greeted me with a warm hug, her advanced pregnancy giving, her a radiant glow despite the obvious fatigue of preparing for both a major move and impending motherhood. Your timing is perfect, she smiled. Doctor says everything looks great for travel, slow and steady with regular breaks. That evening, we shared a simple meal of takeout on their back porch, watching the sunset paint Portland's sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. The conversation flowed easily between practical planning for tomorrow's journey and deeper reflections on the life changes they were embracing. "We found a rental house in Riverside," Tyler explained. "Just 10 minutes from Mom and Dad's condo. Short-term lease while we decide whether to stay beyond the initial 6-month assignment." "They're beside themselves with excitement," I commented. "First-time grandparents with front-row access." Zoe laughed. "Your mother has already volunteered for weekly childcare once I return to work. She's been researching evidence-based infant development activities." The image of my once rigid mother adapting her controlling tendencies into constructive grandparenting brought a smile. The car confrontation years ago had catalyzed changes that continued to ripple through our family interactions in increasingly positive ways. "What about you?" Tyler asked, turning the conversation toward me. "Mom mentioned you've been seeing someone?" "Alex," I confirmed, surprised our mother had shared this detail. "It's still fairly new, just 4 months, but going well. He's an occupational therapist at Greenfield." "Workplace romance," Tyler teased. "Very efficient use of your limited social hours." We continued talking into the evening, 3 adults sharing perspectives and experiences without the competitive undercurrent that had characterized so many family interactions in the past. As we finally prepared for sleep before tomorrow's journey, I felt profound gratitude for the healthy relationships that had emerged from what could have been merely a bitter family rift. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect traveling weather. We loaded the last essential items into Tyler's SUV, Zoe's hospital bag positioned for easy access just in case, snacks and water bottles arranged within reach, pillows positioned to support her comfort during the drive. The professional movers had already departed with the larger furniture and boxed possessions, scheduled to arrive in Riverside the following day. "Navigation set?" I asked from the back seat, where I'd insisted on sitting to give Zoe maximum comfort in the front passenger position. "All programmed," Tyler confirmed. "First stop in about 90 minutes. That lavender farm Zoe likes with the clean restrooms and good tea." As we pulled away from the bungalow, Zoe reached back to squeeze my hand. "Thank you for coming. Having you here makes everything feel safer." The simple acknowledgement of my value, not just as family obligation, but as someone whose presence provided genuine comfort and security, reflected how completely our family dynamics had evolved. The journey south unfolded at a gentle pace, with stops every hour for Zoe to walk briefly and change positions. We shared stories, listened to podcasts, and enjoyed comfortable silences as the landscape gradually transformed from Oregon's lush greenery to Northern California's drier terrain. By late afternoon, we reached our overnight accommodation, a quiet inn near Mount Shasta, where Tyler had reserved a suite with separate bedrooms to ensure everyone's comfort. After dinner at the inn's restaurant, we sat on the outdoor terrace, watching alpenglow paint the mountain's snow-capped peak. The conversation turned to future plans and possibilities. "We're thinking about preschool options already," Zoe admitted with a self-conscious laugh. "Probably premature considering she's not even born yet." "Greenfield has an excellent childcare center for staff," I mentioned. "If you decide to stay in Riverside longer term, I could help you get on the waiting list." "That would be amazing," Tyler said. "Honestly, being near family for these early years is feeling increasingly important. Portland has been wonderful, but the thought of raising our daughter with aunt and grandparent involvement has significant appeal." The comment struck me. My brother, once so focused on his independent path and achievements, now valuing family, connection and support systems in ways neither of us had anticipated. The car that he had once felt entitled to had symbolized independence to me. Now, ironically, he was contemplating returning to our hometown for the community and connection it offered his growing family. The second day of our journey proceeded smoothly, crossing into Oregon by mid-morning. As familiar landmarks began appearing, signaling our approach to Riverside, I noticed Tyler glancing more frequently at Zoe, monitoring her comfort and energy levels with attentive care. "Almost home," he said as we passed the city limits sign. "How are you feeling?" "Ready to not be in a car," she smiled tiredly. "But good, excited." We pulled into the driveway of their rental house, a charming craftsman similar to their Portland home, but with a larger yard shaded by mature oak trees. My parents were waiting on the front porch, having clearly arrived early to prepare for our welcome. My mother had hung a tasteful "Welcome Home" banner, while my father stood beside a clearly homemade wooden cradle, presumably a project from his woodworking cooperative. As we helped Zoe carefully from the car, I stepped back slightly, watching the scene unfold. My brother supporting his pregnant wife, my parents embracing them both with genuine joy, all of them moving forward into this new chapter with open hearts and clear eyes. The contrast with that Sunday dinner 3 years ago could hardly have been more striking. The entitled young man who had expected to be given my car had become a thoughtful husband and soon-to-be father, making deliberate choices based on values rather than convenience. The mother who had declared he deserved my car more than I did had developed respect for individual autonomy alongside her natural protective instincts. The father who had remained silent during conflict now actively engaged in creating nurturing environments for his expanding family. And I had discovered that drawing firm boundaries didn't diminish family connections. It ultimately strengthened them by establishing foundations of mutual respect and authentic care. As we gathered on the porch, my mother linked her arm through mine. "Everything go smoothly?" she asked. "Perfect," I assured her. "Careful pace, regular breaks, no complications." "You've always been the reliable one," she said, and then added something she would never have acknowledged 3 years earlier. "We're fortunate you were there. Your expertise made all the difference." The simple validation, recognition of my value without qualification or comparison, represented everything that had changed in our family dynamic since that pivotal conflict. No longer were contributions measured against each other, with Tyler's needs automatically prioritized. Now, each family member's unique strengths were acknowledged and appreciated for their specific worth. Later that evening, after helping settle Tyler and Zoe into their temporary home, I drove back to my townhouse, Stella's familiar presence carrying me through Riverside's quiet streets. The Honda that had become such a symbolic focal point in Turi. Our family narrative was showing her age now, with over 120,000 miles on the odometer and minor cosmetic wear that I hadn't bothered to address. I had begun researching newer models with advanced safety features and improved fuel efficiency, recognizing that eventually, practical considerations would necessitate replacing this vehicle that had come to represent so much more than transportation. But I felt no urgency. Stella remained reliable, and the decision would be made on my timeline, according to my priorities. As I pulled into my driveway, I realized that the true legacy of that car conflict wasn't about the vehicle itself, but about the transformative power of establishing healthy boundaries. My refusal to give away something I had worked for and valued had initiated ripples of change throughout our family system, encouraging Tyler toward genuine maturity, guiding my mother toward more respectful parenting approaches, emboldening my father to engage more directly, and strengthening my own ability to stand firm in what mattered. The blue Honda sitting in my driveway had become the unlikely catalyst for our family's evolution from rigid patterns of preference and accommodation to more authentic, balanced relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. What had begun as conflict had ultimately fostered connection, deeper and more meaningful precisely because it acknowledged each person's autonomy and worth. I patted Stella's hood affectionately before heading inside, grateful not just for the transportation she had faithfully provided, but for the unexpected journey of growth she had helped initiate. Sometimes the most important destinations aren't geographic but relational, and sometimes the vehicle that gets you there isn't merely the car you drive, but the boundaries you set and the values you protect along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.